Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Technology and Youth Mental Health series. I'm Yuki Katani from the Child Mind Institute, and I'm excited to facilitate today's conversation on a very important topic, the challenges researchers face in studying online services and how public policy could help overcome these obstacles. We've had earlier convenings of experts where we explore the types of data needed to understand how technology impacts kids' mental health and how we evaluate interventions aimed at improving well-being. And at the Child Mind Institute, we believe that more ecological data, real life data, so data that reflects real world interactions between individuals and technology, are essential for these studies. Technology companies collect and store a wide array of data that could transform our understanding of products' mental health effects on young minds. However, researchers currently face significant hurdles in accessing this data, limiting the scope of their studies. So, today we're going to delve deeper into these challenges and explore possible solutions. I'm really pleased to welcome two experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion. First, we have Kate Blocker. She's the Director of Research and Programs at Children and Screens, Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. And we also have Brandon Silverman. He is the former CEO of CrowdTangle and a policy expert in platform transparency and data sharing. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank
Uh,
you.
so let's so let's get started. I'm going to jump right into the first question. The first question is for you, Kate. Kate, can you start by helping us understand the barriers researchers face in studying how people use social media and other technology, and what's the current state of researchers' ability to study company data or collect data from users?
Yes, thank you, Yuki. And I just want to thank Child Mind Institute as well for having this conversation and inviting me to be a part of it. In truth, social media researchers are facing a number of challenges that I think boil down into two things. First, barriers to platform access, and then challenges with self-collected data. So looking at those two things a little more closely, most researchers don't have access directly to the data that platforms have. And those that do, what is available is often controlled by the platforms, both in terms of what data is available, when it is available, and how it is accessed, and sometimes even the actual mechanisms of research and the impacts that that can have. And stability of that access is entirely up to the tech companies and can impact studies that are in progress or that might be trying to launch. We've seen system updates that have been known to crash established systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there are definitely challenges just to accessing the data directly that is there. So many researchers are, in fact, as you know, collecting data themselves, either directly through the users or their research participants, or manually by mining data from publicly available areas of the platform. So looking into those, this is still not flawless data, but it could come through self-report surveys, passive sensing apps, other measures to collect screenshots or screen recordings, and again, that data mining. So there are some challenges or issues with some of these types of data. First, with self-report, this is a subjective measure. So there are always concerns that it could be inaccurate or misleading or biased, depending on what the data is meant to represent. So, for example, we know just on basic measures of screen time use, in different platforms, different types of content, that what what a young person themselves might report versus what their parent might report versus what screen time apps would tell us objectively, that those numbers do vary and represent sort of different things if you think about it from a research perspective. So many researchers are trying to deploy objective tools, so passive sensing apps, screen capture methodologies, but these can be time consuming, they can be expensive, may add to participant burden, and as I noted, do experience significant and continuous disruption, drawing back to, again, those barriers of access. So we've seen system updates, for example, knock an app out of use temporarily, though when I say temporarily, that could take months for that passive sensing app to then update and reset and begin to be able to collect the same data. This has happened to researchers in the middle of studies, in the middle of grants, and having to sort of circumvent what to do next, how to get the data that they need. And, again, adding to how time consuming this work is, how expensive this is, which can limit researchers from jumping into this type of data collection because of some of those risks. And again, as I noted, some increase to participant burden if they have to download a new app, make sure it's running, or capture these screenshots and then submit them to researchers, which can be great if they're willing to do that, but can lead to participant dropout rates, or again, maybe even missing data. And to the public spaces, the data mining, that is a commonly used research method as well. But again, we're looking at data where you can only use what's available in those public spaces. So if I, as a researcher, am going out and trying to mine maybe ad content or post content, I can't access those private conversations or private messages, private posts. And so that those experiences are lost. And it is also time burdensome for researchers to do this kind of work. And they may, in fact, miss data. We're often mining based on keywords or hashtags, which may not capture all of the relevant content that an integrated tool might be able to represent. So, there's a number of risks and challenges. I may not even touched on them all, but I think what is most striking as we talk through all of that, and what brings us here together today, is that we know this data is available and it's just inaccessible. So the tech companies, they have been collecting this data and studying this data for decades, and yet it's at a level of granularity and richness that most academic researchers can only dream of having access to, and the impact that access could have to our ability to understand these impacts and begin to answer some really complicated questions that are still challenging to answer would be incredible for the field.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. Yeah, I mean, you just listed off a number of challenges, and none of them are small by any means, right? It's a laborious process. It's disruptive. It's expensive. Then there's missing data, so the fidelity of the data set that we're able to collect, it just could be augmented if we could get access to company and technology company data. So, no, thank you so much for that. So, sort of piggybacking off of that, Brandon, you worked at Facebook, working to try to improve transparency, making sure that these data sets were more readily available. And now you're an independent voice pushing for government to facilitate researchers' access to data held by social media companies. So, what are government entities already doing? And then what else would policymakers need to do to help overcome the barriers that Kate just mentioned?
Well, the good news is, and by the way, yeah, also thank you for having me. I appreciate being here and being able to talk about this. It's very timely. The good news is there's a lot of regulatory interest around the world around data access and transparency. The bad news is it is hard to get right. And there are a lot of ways in which it can be designed poorly. There's a lack of model legislation that's been used in previous years, et cetera. But I think probably the most significant development in this space by far is what's happening in Europe around the Digital Services Act, which is kind of sometimes colloquially referred to as a transparency machine. But within the Digital Services Act is something called Article 40, which is designed exactly for the purpose of enabling data access and data sharing from what are considered kind of qualifying platforms based on their size, kind of very large online platforms, with independent vetted researchers. Now, if you are very in the weeds of European policymaking, one of the things you come to learn very quickly is that the way the process works is the laws get written, and then it takes a fairly long time to then figure out all the details of what that looks like. And in the moment there, the European Commission is in the process of putting all the meat on the bones of how Article 40 is going to work in practice. And there's a lot of very complicated questions there in the midst of kind of figuring out and writing down and putting pencil to paper on. But I think the expectation among the research community is that what's called the Delegated Act is going to come out sometime this summer, maybe this fall, and that'll spell out a lot of the exact details on how to begin kind of allowing the external research community to start asking for data sets that have previously never been available for a lot of these platforms, and is going to be a very big and important moment. Now, that being said, a lot of things are probably not going to go right in the first iteration, and it's going to take development and refinement. And some of that's going to have to come from the commission. Some of that's going to have to come from platforms. Some of that's going to have to come from the research and civil society community being very clear about what's working and what's not. So I think that's in some ways, I think the most important progress being made on the regulatory side here in the US. There are bills like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which was introduced in the Senate with bipartisan support, that has a bunch of different transparency and data sharing mechanisms. But like a lot of legislation at the congressional level, it is unclear, what its likelihood is on passing. Even for some kid-specific bills like KOSA and others, there are frequently research proposals and data sharing proposals that are attached to them. Happy to get into the weeds on that. They are frequently a source of debate among kind of as KOSA continues to go through its refinements and amendments. Sometimes the provisions stay in there, sometimes they get removed, sometimes they get added back in. But the good news is I think it is people are aware that we need this piece to get any of these policy solutions right, which I think is a really big step forward compared to previous years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting too, right? Is it policymakers sort of creating policies based on what they're hearing? Who has a seat at the table? Who has sort of a voice in policymaking? Right, to make sure that the right data is being the data that research community need is actually being accessed, versus sort of putting some parameters on the data set by policymakers or by the tech companies.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm happy to jump in on that. I mean, one thing
yeah,
I would say, and I find myself bring up a lot, is I do think that there is no single right data set. I think when it comes in this space, there are different types of transparency mechanisms that each accomplish different things. There are data sets that could be incredibly useful and valuable. There are also the ability to do A/B testing on platforms. Is real time monitoring of public content, which is um, also something I spend a lot of time on. And I think one of the things you find when you get into the weeds on this stuff is trying to get clear about which mechanism matters the most to you, which one has the least barriers in whatever country you're in, et cetera. And so there are a lot of details to be worked out once you get into the nitty gritty of it.
yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Kate, is there anything else that you would like to add, sort of on the government and policy side of things?
I think the one thing I'll add, and Brandon covered so much of it very well, but I think one thing I'll add is a lot of the concern often comes up around data privacy protection and how will that be managed and how will user privacy be protected and kept safe. And I think that's an important part of any regulation that's developed. But I also think it's important to emphasize that that's sort of a standing norm for most research, right? That's something that academic researchers are very familiar with doing and have to do in any time they're collecting data, whether it's on their own through these other methods that I mentioned, or if doing so through a system with access to the platform. So I think that's important to make sure it's included and incorporated and spelled out, again, just for transparency, even of how these systems work and how that's communicated. But it's not something that will be brand new to academic researchers by any means, and so it's perfectly reasonable to assume that can be managed effectively as well.
Plus,
Yeah, no, that
plus
makes
one for that.
Yeah, I was just saying, the transparency of how even the data is, even calculated, and what we're getting, is so important. So, no, good to point that out. So moving on to sort of the next question. In part because of outside pressure, companies have invested. So there are some companies that have invested in transparency and data sharing initiatives, but obviously to varying degrees. There's no consistency, there's no standardization. So what lessons can we learn from existing examples? And then are there any best practices that could help these initiatives scale up? Either one of you, if you guys want to jump in.
Well, I know, Brandon can probably share some specific examples of what's been done. So I just want to start by touching on two things that you pointed out, in particular, the varying degrees and because of outside pressure, right? I mean, I think it's very important from a research perspective and from a platform accountability perspective that you don't have different platforms sharing different amounts of data to different degrees and with different levels of transparency and all of these things. That needs to be uniform across, at least platforms within a similar domain, if not all tech companies, broadly stated, both to ensure the consistency in research availability and the accountability, but also back to, do researchers have access to the data they need, right? We're increasingly seeing research pivot from a focus on specific platforms to features across platforms that might spark particular harms or particular benefits. And so if that consistency isn't there, then you are limited in answering some of those questions where you might be able to look cross-platform at similar data. And then again, as you stated, a lot of this is happening right now because of outside pressure. And so I think what's important is not to say, okay, well, the progress is being made, so we can sort of step back from that outside pressure, but acknowledge that it's happening because of that. And we need to build in systems both for that accountability, but also for support, both for the companies and for the researchers to ensure that it's able to be maintained. And there are some best practices that can be touched on in there that I think we've already touched on. Data privacy, making sure there's sort of maybe an independent third party that can support and be that in between, to make sure both sides are acting in best interests of the science and users. And we've seen some models prioritize open science types of approaches. So again, the transparency around how is the data getting collected, how is it being used, what's the research question from the very beginning. So we all know sort of what's going on in the layers there. And then I think one thing that I just want to lift up before I'll stop here is also ensuring protection for these researchers from retaliation. This is something we have seen happening both to nonprofits, to academic centers, and even individual researchers when they start publishing research that may not paint the best light on some of these companies or some of these platforms, and that we see sort of retaliation that can be very challenging particularly for researchers who don't have a ton of resources at hand to defend themselves. So I think something that includes that is always really important as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, not only just standardization, but making sure, right, that the objectives and the goals are aligned across research and the technology companies. So it's a tall order. Hopefully, we can get there, but I think that's sort of where we need to start first and have that sort of collaborative effort. Before moving forward and thinking about how do we scale the data. Brandon, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think the two things that stand out to me the most, on top of what Kate also mentioned, are, even there were a number of years when platforms were actually some platforms were doing a lot of voluntary work in the transparency space. Twitter had tons of academic data sources. They had entire teams dedicated to supporting academics and civil society groups. There was a period when I was at Facebook when, they took our team and, almost 5x'd our entire size. We launched offices in Sao Paulo and Singapore and India, all over the world. And at that exact same time, there were some platforms who weren't doing anything at all. And so even at the peak of voluntary transparency in the industry, there were incredibly important platforms not doing anything. So, and that's to say nothing of what happened when Elon took over Twitter and just completely pulled the rug out of all those programs. When Meta ultimately decided they wanted to move in a different direction around some of this space. So for me, single biggest lesson by far is that we can't rely on voluntary efforts from industry. But and then I think the second one is, it is not, I think we're a little bit tilting at windmills if we are simply trying to get access to all the data that platforms have. There are going to be very few organizations that are in a position to do anything with that data, even if we get past all of the hurdles of getting access to it in a meaningful way. And there's much more impact to be found in being strategic and thoughtful and smart about what data sets we actually want, and making sure that whatever research we're doing has a fast turnaround time. The half-life of how meaningful this research is on platforms that are changing constantly is not the same as the normal half-life for most academic research. And so we have to find ways to have fast turnaround times in this entire space.
Yeah, no, that's actually important. And then add in the layer of policy and the length of time it can take to get policy in place. It adds a whole nother level of complexity. And Brandon, this actually is a great segue into sort of the next question, right? So researching social media continues to be sort of a major focus for this need for research and transparency in the data. But this also exists in other new technologies that are coming up. So how might we think about policy and other transparency mechanisms that are durable enough to help not only today, but these future technologies that are coming very fast and iterating very quickly?
Yeah, well, I think one answer is actually we don't need to constantly reinvent the wheel, and that there are a lot of basic approaches that work in lots of other industries and spaces, on lots of other technologies and formats and mediums, that have the ability to be applied to future technologies get invented. And one of the most concrete examples I point to around this is when it comes to AI. I think social media transparency, which is what we've been lobbying for in PATA, which is a big part of DSA, et cetera, is actually one of the biggest components of AI transparency there is. If you are worried about deepfakes and the impact of generative AI in spreading false information or interfering with elections or other sort of stuff, what also matters is how that content gets distributed. And if most people are still going to a handful of small sources to get most of their news and content, then what is happening on those platforms is actually how you figure out the impact that generative, AI generated content is spreading and having on people. So there are actually a lot of ways in which we don't need to constantly reinvent things, but we've been doing internet governance for 40 plus years, and there are a lot of lessons we've learned in that process that we can continue to apply even on future technologies.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And Kate, is there anything that you would like to add from sort of the research and children's screens perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, Brandon. And I would just add, I think anything new that might come out or be proposed, it would be nice to build in that flexibility and that ability to adapt, not just to new technologies, like AI or different technologies like AI, but also the way that we might expect social media to change, right? So whatever these systems are or these, policies, regulations are, they need to be flexible enough to adapt to how tech adapts as Brandon notes, very quickly, right? And so I think that's important. But I also think acknowledging that, I think the hope is that we can have something that's flexible so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, or at least start to set sort of a standard expectation that makes any future attempts move faster by sort of setting the norm. But also that there may be times when a new technology does require, again, even just to the simple question of what data do we need? What data is helpful for researchers? What data is helpful for the accountability piece? And what data, is specifically okay to maybe not be shared widely, that we don't need all of that data out there if there's potential risks that might be unique to that new technology. And being able to have technical experts who really understand what those benefits, cost benefit analysis would be on hand to help with that.
You guys, thank you so much. And we just covered, obviously, in a very short period of time, a large breadth of information around data transparency, data access. So just to kind of quickly summarize, some of the main key takeaways that I took, right? I mean, data access problems, challenges, risks, is a large issue that we definitely need to tackle in order to help propel research, and using that data to then help write the policies that will benefit everyone, especially in this situation in the context of Child Mind Institute, youth and their mental health. But there's also kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, which is there is a lot of regulatory interest in this. We just don't have the right policies in place. There's a lot of sort of people at the table that have opinions, and so we need to have the right people at the table to write the policies to be able to enable the data access for research. And then and part of that policy is to hopefully create that standardization that we need around data sharing initiatives, making sure that it's transparent, and that the frameworks are sort of consistent throughout. And then lastly, I think what I'm hearing from everyone here is that policy makers need to be part of this process to ensure that we have buy-in from everyone, and that this is not just a voluntary effort, that this is really a collaborative effort to ensure that the sharing of data actually happens. So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Brandon, for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate your expertise. And for everyone in the audience, we'll include their LinkedIn profiles so you can follow them, and their Twitter so you can follow everything that they're posting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yuki.